Hey guys, Wyatt Claypool here. Well, it's another day, another trade screw up by Prime Minister Mark Carney. Today, in the House of Commons, when questioned by federal Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre, Carney had to admit to a poor choice of words when he talked dismissively about not needing to speak to US President Donald Trump. It's so obvious what Carney has to do to get a trade deal, and he refuses to do it. Trump is not that complicated of a man. Carney was also the guy who said, I've negotiated with people like Donald Trump before during the election, and then he has blown past every deadline he has set for himself to try and get a trade deal done because he clearly has never negotiated like with someone like Trump before. Running Brookfield Asset Management, being the chair of it, is not nearly as tough of a job as you would think. He's a savvy person, but he doesn't exactly have business savvy the same way Donald Trump does. Brookfield Asset Management mainly makes money on cornering subsidy markets, going into green energy, battery tech, on other areas where the government throws tax breaks, grants, and massive subsidies towards the industry. So when he tries to negotiate with Trump, he doesn't really understand the sort of business acumen and attitude that he has. Trump is looking for a win, and Canada can have a win at the same time. You just have to pitch it to Trump as being a Trump win. But Carney goes in there with the attitude of, well, I'm just negotiating for a win with as Canada, and I'm going to beat those Americans. Well, Trump, who has a bigger country and more political power than you, is obviously not going to look like a fool by the end of the negotiation. So every time Carney gets in there and says, I want everything, I'm going to give you nothing, obviously we're going to come to no agreement. We need to have a win-win scenario where we team up with the US against China and use that as the excuse for why we need no tariffs. But that's enough from me, guys. We need to get to this clip because it is quite great seeing Carney squirm around and have to admit to his own failures here.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition. Before the election, he promised elbows up. After, it was who cares? Yeah. Before the election, he said the tariffs were an existential crisis. Now he says they're not a burning issue. Before the election, he promised to negotiate a win. After, he backed down to American tariffs, and those tariffs have now doubled on Canadian aluminum, autos, and steel, and tripled on Canadian lumber. Before the election, he promised the fastest growing economy in the G7. After, he delivered the fastest shrinking economy. Why is the Prime Minister before the election so much different than the one after?
Yeah, the right honorable. You could even tell the jeering started when Poilievre started going down this line of questioning, because this is where Carney is the absolute weakest. That was like his only real promise during the election, was getting a trade deal, giving Canada some stability, and we have not gotten it. And people can always say, well, it would have been worse with Poilievre. Well, let Poilievre be prime minister and prove it. Because so far, it's only been Carney screwing up. So you can't just say, well, this was inevitable. Oh, well, you can't negotiate with Trump. Well, then don't promise you can. And I guarantee you actually can negotiate with Trump. You just have to understand the man properly. And Carney's liberal base doesn't want to understand Trump. They want elbows up. They want to thumb their nose. They want basically this mythical version of Mark Carney to drive down to Washington, D.C. on the turret of an Abrams tank and slap Trump across the face, and just say, you're going to give me everything I want. And you're going to give me Vermont, too, so we can monopolize the maple syrup market. It's not going to work that way. You're not going to bully Trump into getting what you want. You also don't have to let Trump bully you. You have to act respectfully, but you also have to make sure to satisfy the ego of the American administration to make it feel like they can go back to their voters with a win. Just as our politicians want to go back to our voters with a win, you have to make it work on both sides. But let's get to Carney's response here.
Mr. Speaker, on the night of the election, when I had the great honor from my constituents of being elected as a deputy of this House, unlike some others in the chamber today, I made a promise to Canadians. When I make a mistake, I'll admit it. That was a poor choice of words about a serious issue. And the serious issue is, what progress are we making structurally? Look, best deal in the world, strongest budget in the world, and the most new trade deals.
Sorry, the strongest budget in the world. The strongest budget in the world apparently includes $55 billion in debt servicing costs, which is bigger than the healthcare transfer. It includes $78 billion in a deficit, which they tried to pretend, oh, that's just because we're investing so much in ourselves. And then they got called out by the interim parliamentary budget officer, Jason Jacques, who said, no, a lot of this is actually just operating expenses that have been miscategorized as infrastructure to pretend these are new investments. They're just typical operating expenses, and we would still be in a deficit even if we took away all of the new infrastructure spending. Whoa, we have the strongest budget in the G7. We have the best deal. Of course, we have technically the best trade deal. We are the only country we're the biggest country along the border with the United States. Obviously, we're going to have a better deal than Argentina, than France, than UK, than Korea. Of course, we're going to have a better deal. The point, though, is that our deal still needs to be in proportion to the amount of trade. The thing is, even if we have a lower tariff than somewhere like Japan does or Vietnam does, they don't trade with the United States as much as we do. Those other countries with their biggest trading partners have no tariffs. We want no tariffs with our biggest trading partner. So from that relative perspective, we have a terrible trade deal right now. This is the problem that Carney does not want to actually recognize. And he's acting like, oh, let's go over the accomplishments. Those things he just said were either false, it is not the strongest budget in the G7, oh my goodness, no. And then the other thing is like, oh, it's the strongest budget. It's the best trade deal with the United States. Sorry, did he achieve that? That was pre-existing since like the beginning of time. That's existed with the US since like the 80s, that we've had basically the best trade deal anyone has with the United States, which makes sense. We trade with them 80%. So obviously the best trade deal previously was Canada. Relative to other countries' amount of trade with the US, our trade deal sucks.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister did make a mistake. He's made many mistakes. In fact, it's been nothing but mistakes when it's come to trade. Look at it. This Prime Minister promised that he would negotiate a win on softwood lumber. Now he says, who cares? Well, Conservatives care. Within 80 days of the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, taking office, he managed to eliminate American tariffs on softwood lumber and get refunds of them. This Prime Minister has now had 8 months, and those tariffs have now more than tripled. Prime Minister asks, who cares? I can tell you, on behalf of all the MPs on this side, we care about the jobs that are being lost in Lumbertown. Why doesn't he?
It's actually a great election sort of slogan of who cares, Conservatives care. And you can just keep having advertisements play of who cares. And then you can just have Mark Carney just say, who cares? I don't need to call Trump. I don't need to get a deal signed, blah, blah, blah. And him just blowing off the issue. And then you can always cut back to, Conservatives actually care about this. Conservatives actually care about that. But that's my electoral strategy brain kicking in here. But this is Carney, you're doing a bad job when your own words can become a slogan against you in the next election. But let's get back to Carney's response.
Mr. Speaker, this government cares about creating jobs in this country. That's why we proposed a budget before this House that catalyzes $1 trillion of investment.
Oh my goodness, it's catalyzing things. Oh my goodness, people. Every time he says catalyze, my life dies. My life just shortens by a year every time he says catalyze. It's so bad. Honestly, Carney won the last election in spite of himself. It was because of the Trump issue. It was because of the weakness of Jagmeet Singh. And I would say in part it was because conservative advisors in the last election told Poilievre, oh, don't touch this issue, don't touch that one. Just have a slightly more moderate position on immigration than the Liberals do. Have a slightly more moderate tax plan. Reduce taxes a little bit more than the Liberals. I think that also helped Carney. But Carney did not bring out voters. Maybe there's a sort of voter who remembers him as the Bank of Canada, the head of the Bank of Canada. Maybe. Same time, goodness, he comes off elitist in a terrible way. There are some people who are elite, but they don't upset people with their elite status. Trump is somebody who is a billionaire, but he doesn't come off elite in a lot of ways. People can like or dislike Trump, but he doesn't come off as sneering, whereas Carney comes off as sneering even when he's trying to sound like triumphant for the country.
No, 5 years. The member opposite and his colleagues, those who could make it into the room, voted against that budget, voted against Canadian workers, voted against Canada's future. We believe in this country, Mr. Speaker, and we are building it.
It just kind of trailed off there at the end. I always like when people just like they just cast whatever they put up as a bill, like, oh, you voted against Canadians, you voted against more school lunches and dental care and all this stuff. It's like, you realize if taxes were just across the board lower, and I invite the federal Conservatives, run on a 20%, even just an 18% across the board tax cut, including corporate. If you did that, you wouldn't need a school lunch programs. You wouldn't need dental care. And even then, we still don't really need it, because in paying for it, we tax people more, so then they can't afford to give their kids like a school lunch. That's always the catch-22 of it. The government taxes and regulates the economy to the point where people need the government to pay for certain things for them, when if the government just stopped doing this all from the beginning and stopped taxing people so hard, stopped hurting the economy, nobody would ever need the government for anything. It's funny how we somehow survived the Harper government without school lunch programs and universal dental. It's almost like people were more financially stable at the time. But now I just want to cut to a ad that the Conservatives are running right now that I think is actually quite a good one, even though I actually sometimes disagree with, Carney's not protecting our auto jobs enough. It's not that I disagree with the actual idea of like protecting jobs, but I just always want to make sure we avoid protectionist language, because protectionism doesn't actually protect jobs. It in fact just holds the economy in stasis. When you overprotect your economy, you end up just basically weakening it from the inside. Yes, you're not losing jobs, but you're making the economy more bloated, more reliant on like taxing foreign goods and whatnot. And I know that's not what the Conservatives mean, but I would say that I would be going after the Liberals on the side of that they're the ones who have been weakening the economy over time, and that's why the jobs are flooding out. It's not because of not enough counter tariffs or not enough strength. It has to do with the government trying to be too big right now, which I do know that that's still a conservative philosophy, though, that we need smaller government.
Elbows Up didn't do anything, did it?
Hundreds of Canadian auto workers will soon be out of jobs, and General Motors is blaming American tariffs.
When was the last time you spoke to the president?
Who cares? I mean, it's a detail. It's a detail. I spoke to him. I'll speak to him again when it matters.
From manufacturing to transportation, industries hit hardest by tariffs are also getting hit hard by job losses. Windsor now has an unemployment rate of 11.1%. In Oshawa, it's climbed to 9%. Here, General Motors is slowing production at this plant because of tariffs, forcing one of its parts suppliers to lay off 250 workers.
Who cares?
So yeah, you messed up if you're Mark Carney, when literally the Conservatives can just take a couple seconds of you talking and turn it into an entire attack ad on you. Again, the tariffs are kind of why the cars are moving, like the car manufacturing jobs are moving back to the United States. In part, that's because Carney has been a terrible negotiator on trade. Also, it's just because of just the domestic economic policy rot in Canada. Our domestic economic policy is terrible. If we just lower taxes, if we just lowered regulations, there could even be a 25% tariff. But if our own car manufacturers, the companies operating in Canada, paying significantly less taxes, they could probably just eat that cost and continue working without losing employees. The thing is that we subsidize these jobs, and the subsidies aren't enough. And it turns out that subsidizing an industry does not protect it forever. In fact, what we need to be doing is making it easier to operate in Canada. And in fact, that would give us more bargaining chips with the Americans if we had a more robust economy, if our economy was more self-sufficient because of the lower taxes and regulations that you can operate in Canada very easily without needing to outsource jobs elsewhere. We would have a stronger position negotiating with Donald Trump to say, you know what? you're not going to be able to beat us on this one because we're like operating in Singapore out here. We have very low taxes, very low regulations. Your car companies would rather operate here even with the tariffs. So how about we get back to zero tariffs and we'll, make some investments in the US economy. We'll get rid of the supply management in dairy and poultry, and then we'll figure out a way of, taking on China together, and we can kind of form a international coalition against Chinese communism. We could do that, but Carney is petrified of touching the dairy and poultry issue because that's his voting base in Quebec and Ontario. And even those farmers, really, I think they'd actually still vote for a government who would get rid of supply management as long as their taxes were lowered, as long as it was easier to operate. Again, that industry has become less efficient over time because they've never had to be efficient, because you have a certain quota that you are allowed to supply into the economy, and people have to purchase your product for a certain amount of money. American dairy companies or dairy farms are much bigger than Canada's. They're not like mega dairies, just the average, family farm is bigger because you have to be a little bit bigger. In Canada, you can get away being a dairy farmer with like on average 86 cows. It's pretty minor. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that there is a place for a smaller dairy farm in Canada. But the thing is that we have subsidized it so much with the quota system that we've basically allowed not just our economy to unfairly compete with the rest of the world by tariffing all their dairy and poultry. The thing is that those dairy farmers and poultry farmers who are allowed to operate right now are unfairly competing within our own country. Alberta has 12% of the population, but only 7% of the dairy and eggs and poultry quota. That's a problem. And you can say, oh, so you want our dairy and poultry farmers to go bankrupt? No, I want them to all thrive. The problem is we are only letting some thrive and we're blocking the rest out of the market. That's socialism, and I'm not a socialist, so I don't support stuff like that. Again, I think we can have standards and saying, hey, we don't want ultra pasteurized milk coming into our economy. We don't want low quality product. Pass that regulation, we can enforce that, but it can't just be an arbitrary, everything outside the country is being tariffed to death, because it in fact makes our own industry less efficient and hurts the actual economy overall. The consumer is basically paying for an inefficient industry. Anyways, with that all being said, thank you guys for watching. Make sure to like, share, subscribe. I will be back tomorrow with more stories from the BC legislature. There was a fantastic bill that One BC put up banning foreign and ideological flags from flying on provincial public property. And the voting result, especially in the BC Conservative camp, was really interesting because yesterday they were trying to steal some of the One BC thunder by trying to message a little bit like One BC, and then they show up today and 2/3 of their MLAs vote against this extremely common sense bill. I mean, like, so common sense that like centrist mayors, center-left mayors like Jeremy Farkas in Calgary are putting up bills saying, let's just keep the flagpoles to be neutral. It's the Canadian flag, provincial flag, the city flag, and maybe the Union Jack. That's all that flies on our flagpoles. The 2/3 of the BC Conservatives couldn't even bring themselves to vote for that most common of common sense bills. Anyways, so with that all being said, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all later.